Can you believe, almost 1,000 years ago, men voluntarily chose a prison of ice? This isn't just a story of monks praying. This is the true account of the world's most extreme psychological endurance test, waged high above the clouds, where the very air thins out, stealing your breath and sanity. They called it the Monastery of St. Egidius, but the locals whispered a different name: the Citadel of the Frozen Dead.
Imagine this. It is the year 150 CE. Europe is a brutal, muddy expanse of kings and famine. But hundreds of feet higher, pressed against the unforgiving spine of the Alps, existed a secret society dedicated to defying nature itself. Their mission was simple, yet utterly insane: achieve perfect, unbroken silence. Not just the absence of speech, but the total annihilation of sound, thought, and physical comfort.
This silence was not peace. It was a weapon. It was meant to carve out the soul, leaving nothing but devotion. But what happens when the silence becomes too loud? What happens when the relentless, crushing pressure of the deep alpine winter decides to claim its tribute, and the very foundation of their faith begins to crack under the strain?
A catastrophe no one saw coming was already unfolding, hidden behind walls 3 feet thick, insulated by centuries of prayer and ice. The cold was a physical entity here, a sentient predator that stalked the narrow, freezing corridors. Every morning, the monks woke up knowing the next breath could be their last, battling a relentless, microscopic war against hypothermia that science wouldn't understand for another 1,000 years. Our story begins with Brother Matthias, a man who 6 months prior had been a jovial carpenter from the sun-drenched valleys below. Now he was a ghost, his skin translucent, his spirit ground down by the ceaseless, agonizing lack of sound. His duty was the bell tower, a cruel irony, as the single massive bronze bell was forbidden to ring, reserved only for one terrifying purpose: the final, desperate signal of absolute, unavoidable disaster. But on the eve of the deepest winter solstice, something unthinkable happened. Matthias wasn't shivering from the cold. He was shivering from a sound he shouldn't have heard, a sound that pierced the absolute vacuum of the monastery's enforced quiet, echoing off the ice-coated stone. It was a rhythmic, scratching noise, emanating from deep within the granite bedrock beneath the altar itself. Can you process the terror of that moment? You are committed to silence, bound by eternal vows, and yet the mountain beneath your sanctuary is speaking to you. Not with a crash or a collapse, but with a slow, deliberate scrape. 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 The scratch wasn't natural. It was too regular, too intentional. And if it wasn't the mountain settling, and it wasn't the wind howling, then what ancient frozen horror had the monks accidentally awakened by digging their pious fortress into the sacred, desolate heart of the Alps? The abbot, Father Cassian, was the keeper of the monastery's ancient secrets, a man whose face looked carved from the same gray marble as the chapel floor. He knew the legends, tales of the sleepers, entities rumored to rest under the high peaks, disturbed only by the deepest penetration of man. Cassian had dismissed them as folklore, necessary evils for scaring away greedy treasure hunters. But now, as the scratching intensified, vibrating through the stone where they knelt, even his faith was turning to dust. Matthias, breaking the fundamental rule of his life, risked damnation. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the flagstone floor beside the altar. It was intensely cold, but beneath the cold, he felt the unmistakable pulse of movement. Something was moving down there, something large.
He looked up at the massive bronze bell, silent, frozen. His mind screamed for the sound, for the deafening, liberating clang that would shatter the silence and alert the few scattered villages 20 miles down the treacherous slope. But the vow held him tighter than any chain. To ring the bell prematurely was spiritual suicide. To wait might be physical oblivion for everyone.
The monks continued their midnight vigil, their heads bowed, pretending the earth wasn't whispering dark, cold promises of their demise. This was the ultimate test. Can faith survive when the very ground beneath you is actively trying to swallow you whole? They had mastered the silence outside. Now they had to master the panic inside. The scraping stopped abruptly. The stillness that followed was heavier, colder, more absolute than before. Matthias held his breath, every nerve ending screaming. He thought they were safe. He thought whatever it was had passed or returned to slumber. But then, the air in the nave, already thin and freezing, shifted. A smell, utterly alien to the scent of ancient incense and freezing stone, drifted past the terrified monks. It was the stench of disturbed earth, mixed with something sharp, metallic, and undeniably alive. This wasn't just a physical threat. It was a violation of their sacred space, a horror that defied the natural laws of the mountain. And as Brother Matthias finally stood up, risking the abbot's fury, his eyes fixed on the altar, he saw the ultimate proof. A single black fissure, spider webbing across the pristine marble floor, directly beneath the communion rail. And from that crack, a sliver of darkness, wet and gleaming, began to ooze forth, dripping slowly onto the cold stone. The silence was finally broken, not by the bell, but by the smallest, most terrifying sound a man dedicated to quiet could ever make: a choked, involuntary gasp. The citadel of the frozen dead was about to discover that sometimes the greatest terror lies not in the things that scream, but in the things that silently, deliberately, climb out of the dark. The true nightmare of the Alps had just begun. The absolute silence, once their greatest spiritual shield, had become their most agonizing torment. They had been taught that mutitas, perpetual silence, was the bridge to the divine, but now it was a soundproofed cage where fear could ferment, unchecked, until it drove men mad. The moment the scraping sound ceased, an even more terrifying reality took hold. The monster outside was not confused or lost. It was listening. It was learning the cadence of their terror, waiting for the inevitable moment when human frailty would betray the rigid discipline of the stone walls. The brothers of Sanctus Ferrum, high above the treacherous Rhone Valley, in the relentless grip of the 11th century Alps, knew the cold intimately. But this cold was different. It felt intelligent.
It bit with focused malice, a sharp, metallic sting that tasted of ozone and ancient disturbed rock, seeping through the thick woolen habits and chilling the very fluids in their eyes. Brother Elias knelt in the freezing scriptorium, his hands clenched so tight the blood had fled his knuckles, leaving them ghostly white against the dark wood of his kneeler. He was trying to reconcile the immovable truth of his faith with the undeniable subterranean tremor that continued to pulse beneath the flagstones.
This was not a geological slip. This was not the settling of the massive timbers under the crushing weight of snow. This was rhythmic, heavy, and sickeningly purposeful, like something enormous struggling to pull itself free from a cryogenic embrace it had endured since the dawn of time. Every monk in that chapel, sworn to utter silence, was screaming internally, a silent cacophony of pure panic that threatened to shatter the spiritual integrity of the entire compound. Prior Anselm, the shepherd of this silent, frozen flock, stood like a statue carved from glacial ice. His mind was a battlefield, struggling to maintain the fragile balance. If he signaled panic, if he broke the vow of Mutitas himself, the resulting chaos would destroy the order faster than any external threat. His duty was to God, even if God's creation seemed to be actively trying to claw its way through his chapel door. He watched the flickering shadows of the tallow lamps, which seemed to stretch and contort themselves into grotesque, elongated shapes that mirrored the terror in his heart. The flickering was less about the oil and more about the unnatural pressure change in the air, a subtle atmospheric shift indicating that whatever was outside was massive, and it was displacing the very breath around the monastery. The walls of Sanctus Ferrum, built from granite quarried by hands long since dust, were 3 feet thick, designed to withstand the crushing force of avalanches. Yet Elias could now hear, or perhaps feel, a new sound emerging, a slow, deep groan emanating from the rock itself, the sound of ancient stone complaining under an unbearable, localized pressure. It wasn't spread across the structure. It was focused on the corridor leading from the main snow-locked entrance. The monastery was structured around the principle of isolating the spiritual from the physical world. The main door, the Porta Inferni, gate of the underworld, as the monks grimly called the entrance to the mortal world, was sealed with iron and massive ice-coated bolts, ensuring total, deadly isolation. But the sound coming now was horrifyingly intimate. It wasn't scraping against the ice, it was grinding against the bolts. The metal, cold as the void between stars, began to shriek, a low, drawn-out cry that cut through the silence like a scalpel, violating the sanctity of their self-imposed tomb. It was the terrifying sound of forged iron being forced against its will. Elias squeezed his eyes shut, tasting the copper tang of fear on his tongue. He knew the lore of the mountains, the ancient pagan stories the local villagers whispered about rock trolls, sleeping giants, and things that preferred the absolute dark. The monks had dismissed them as peasant superstition. But now, pinned by the crushing silence and the undeniable physical violation of their sanctuary, those myths felt terrifyingly real. He risked a single, agonizingly slow glance toward the prior. Anselm's face was a mask of cold resolve, but his eyes, deep-set and shadowed, held the terrible knowledge of a man watching his life's work, his spiritual fortress, being systematically dismantled by a force he could neither fight nor flee. He signaled nothing, offered no comfort, just maintained his unwavering, deadly silence. The air inside the chapel grew so cold that the oil in the lamps began to thicken visibly, and the shallow breathing of the monks left plumes of white mist in the air, a visual sign of life that, in the silence, felt like a screaming admission of their presence. They were trapped between the crushing pressure of the creature outside and the unforgiving, suffocating vow of silence within. The grinding intensified, punctuated by sickening, hollow thuds, suggesting that whatever was attacking the door was using massive, blunt force, not subtle manipulation. It was testing the limits of 11th century engineering, seeking the precise weakness in their defense. Then came the ultimate betrayal of the material world. A high-pitched, vibrating ping echoed through the scriptorium, followed by a shower of microscopic, frozen granite dust that feathered down from the stone lintel above the corridor door. The pressure had found its entry point. The creature was not just leaning. It was exerting a force so immense it was literally pulverizing the solid rock around the iron strapping. In that instant, Elias knew the iron bolts would fail, not from being pried open, but from the granite structure around them disintegrating. The true nightmare of the Alps had just taken the first physical bite out of the monastery, and the monks, bound by their sacred vow, could only watch, silent and screaming, as the dark outside prepared to step over the threshold. The bite was not merely wind or ice. It was a structural wound, a gaping maw torn into the thick 11th century stone. Dust motes, previously lazy and drifting in the narrow shafts of morning light, now danced like frantic ghosts fleeing a predator. The temperature inside the scriptorium plummeted instantly, dropping more degrees in a single heartbeat than it should have over an entire night of blizzard. This was not natural climate change. This was an invasion, deliberate and malicious, targeting the very heart of their sanctuary. Father Theodoric, the prior whose face was a map of 40 winters spent defying the summit, felt the sacred chill of the chapel floor turn into the paralyzing grip of the grave. His breath, usually controlled and shallow, became a shuddering visible cloud, a tiny, fragile prayer dissipating uselessly in the cathedral of the cold. Every fiber of his being screamed for decisive action, to command the brothers to barricade the hole, to break the great silence, to shout the name of God against the howling void outside. But the lex silentium was the very bedrock of their existence, the highest offering they could make to the divine. To speak was not just a sin. It was to admit defeat, to concede that the physical world, the temporary shell of stone and mortar, held more sway than the eternal commitment of the soul. He simply stood, a statue of agonizing virtue, watching the crystalline horror crawl inward, unable to violate the sacred rule that was now actively murdering them. The cold moved like oil, thick and slow, hugging the floor before rising, serpentine, toward the high, vaulted ceiling. It was carrying something with it, too, a scent of pulverized rock and something ancient, something that smelled like the deep, unbreathing interior of the planet itself. The hole, roughly the size of a man's chest, was now rimmed with jagged shards of ice that seemed to pulse with a faint, sick luminescence. It was the sound that followed the breach that truly shattered the equilibrium of their stoic commitment. It wasn't the roar of the wind or the crack of falling timber, but a low, guttural vibration that resonated directly in the bone marrow, bypassing the ear entirely. Imagine the sound of 1,000 tons of granite being slowly, agonizingly ground together beneath the weight of God's displeasure. This terrifying resonance was the mountain breathing, and its breath was the cold that kills. Brother Elias, huddled near the dying brazier, his hands blue and useless, gripped his rosary so tightly the wood splintered beneath his frozen fingers. His mind was a frantic cacophony of panicked prayers and desperate curses, a private, roaring rebellion that no one, thank heavens, could hear. He wanted to scream, "Run!" He wanted to shout, "Fire!" He wanted to simply emit one single, human sound of mortal terror, to prove he was still alive and not yet claimed by the sentient white death. But the silence held them hostage. It was the heavy, velvet shroud of their dedication, suffocating them, while the very air they breathed turned into blades of ice. The vow, meant to bring them closer to the purity of heaven, was now the instrument of their slow, agonizing execution, the ultimate psychological torture, facing imminent, violent death, yet forbidden the primal relief of a cry for help. Geologists, centuries later, would try to rationalize this phenomenon as ice quakes or seismic activity exacerbated by extreme temperature inversion. But the men of 1050 CE knew the truth. They understood the language of the mountain better than any modern science. The mountain was not simply cold. It was angry, and it was speaking through the stone. The low resonance began to modulate, shifting from a deep rumble to a rhythmic, almost deliberate pounding. Thump, pause, thump. It sounded like a massive, subterranean heart struggling to beat beneath the colossal weight of the Alps. With every rhythmic pulse, the floor of the chapel shuddered violently, and tiny, ancient fissures, cracks that had held stable for decades, began to weep fine dust and chips of ice, spitting them onto the sacred floor. The prior realized with a sickening lurch that their material defenses were worthless. Their great thick walls, built to withstand Viking raids and century-long sieges of snow, were being unzipped like cheap cloth. The enemy was not external, it was fundamental. It was the core of the rock they had built their sanctuary upon, turning against them. He looked toward the crucifix, hoping for divine intervention, a sudden burst of warmth, or perhaps a sign that their devotion was still registered in the heavens. But the shadows cast by the meager lamps seemed deeper, hungry, and the silver on the crucifix was already coated in a delicate, deathly rime of frost, obscuring the face of Christ entirely. In the absence of sound, communication became a grotesque pantomime of terror. Brother Augustine, the youngest, pointed a shaking finger at the widening hole, his eyes wide and pleading for permission to fetch the heavy oak door they used for emergency barricades. Theodoric understood the plea instantly, but hesitated. If they moved now, if they showed panic, the fragile discipline of the community would shatter, releasing the emotional chaos that the vow was meant to contain. Discipline, he believed, was their last best defense against the literal chaos rushing toward them. He shook his head minutely, a movement so small it could have been mistaken for a tremor of the cold. No, they would wait. They would pray. They would endure the siege of silence and cold, trusting that faith, not lumber, was the true defense against the infernal mountain. But the mountain did not wait for their silent obedience. With a final, agonizing crunch that sounded like the snapping of a giant femur, the breach widened further, and then, through the gaping, jagged mouth in the wall, something entered. It wasn't a wolf, or a man, or an avalanche of snow. It was a column of solid, crystalline fog, supernaturally dense, radiating an absolute zero that seemed to extinguish light itself.
This fog did not dissipate. It coiled. It moved with the sluggish, purposeful intent of a creature hunting in its native element. It was the distilled essence of the peak, the ancient, predatory cold given physical form. And its first, silent target was the only source of heat left in the room, the struggling iron brazier.
As the frozen mist touched the glowing embers, the brazier did not hiss or steam. It simply died. The deep orange glow vanished instantly, replaced by a dull, hopeless blackness. The air lost the last desperate memory of warmth, and the monks, their spiritual fortitude stretched to the breaking point, knew that the siege was over. The enemy was inside the walls, and it had just turned out the lights. The vow of silence was about to meet the chilling reality of absolute annihilation. The darkness that fell upon the Grande Chartreuse was not merely the absence of light. It was a physical, crushing weight, pressed down by the 1,000,000 tons of granite surrounding them. It was a darkness woven from the very fabric of the 11th century, untouched by any notion of easy illumination. Absolute, final, and suffocating. Brother Thomas, frozen mid-prayer, felt the last vestiges of warmth drain from the stone floor beneath his bare feet. The air in the scriptorium, already frigid, plummeted instantly, seizing the moisture in his lungs until breathing itself became an act of agonizing, silent resistance. This was not a power failure. This was the mountain rejecting them, spitting them out, pulling the blanket of the cosmos over their small, insignificant flame. The silence, their most prized spiritual weapon, had become the enemy's amplifier, turning the inner chamber of the monastery into a pressurized tomb. For weeks they had endured the low, subsonic moan emanating from the depths, a sound too deep for the ear, but perfectly calibrated to vibrate the ribs and shatter the soul. Now that moan intensified, escalated. For weeks they had endured the low, subsonic moan emanating from the depths, a sound too deep for the ear, but perfectly calibrated to vibrate the ribs and shatter the soul. Now that moan intensified, escalating from a distant threat to a localized, palpable vibration that rattled the ancient bone fragments held within the altar. It wasn't the wind. It was the slow, purposeful grinding of colossal, indifferent gears. It sounded like the entire Dauphiné mountain range was shifting its massive shoulders, preparing to shrug off the small monastery like a nuisance insect clinging to an exposed ledge. The lamp oil, meticulously rendered from animal fats and kept burning by the sacristan, had failed simultaneously in every room. It was an impossibility of physics, a collective, unnatural extinction of every single flame, suggesting a malign intelligence behind the blackout. Thomas's mind raced through the meticulous rule of Saint Benedict, the ancient guide to their lives, searching for a contingency for the moment the devil turns off all the candles at once and the temperature drops to absolute zero. No such chapter existed in the sacred texts. They were trained to endure pain, to crave isolation, to embrace the Lectio Divina even while shivering. But they were not prepared for coordinated, silent, spiritual sabotage enacted by the physical environment itself. Thomas could sense the pure, distilled terror radiating off the dozen other cloistered figures nearby, black silhouettes against a black void. Every monk knew that breaking the votum silenti, the vow of silence, was a mortal sin in the face of spiritual testing. Yet the urge to scream, to confirm that he was not the last man alive in creation, was almost unbearable in its intensity. He could hear their ragged, shallow breathing, the only sound permitted, now horribly amplified in the total vacuum of noise. The air was so still, so dead, so unnaturally heavy, that the movement of dust motes felt like a thunderclap striking the eardrum. Then came the tremor. It wasn't the slow, rolling quake of the earth settling. It was a sharp, violent jolt, aimed precisely at the foundations of the chapel, where the most sacred, irreplaceable relics of the Carthusian order were housed in their protective gold casings. Above them, in the vaulted ceiling of the refectory, the massive, centuries-old wooden beams, oak, reinforced with iron straps forged by the greatest smiths of Burgundy, began to protest the strain. Not with a crack, but with a horrifying, drawn-out shriek of tortured wood. It was the sound of lumber being torn, fiber by fiber, against its will, submitting to an invisible, overwhelming pressure. The monastery was not just cold, it was structurally failing, assaulted by an unseen, focused force that understood engineering weaknesses better than any medieval siege master or battering ram. Abbot Hugo, a man whose face was usually a mask of serene, ascetic discipline, was visible only as the faintest, darkest shadow near the high altar. Thomas strained his eyes, praying the abbot would give a sign, a silent command to evacuate, or perhaps to pray harder, to redouble their discipline. But Hugo remained statue still, upholding the law of the order, even as annihilation pressed in from all sides. Even as the mountain tried to swallow their sanctuary whole, the vow held. Silence was their shield, their sacrifice, and now, perhaps, it was rapidly becoming their immutable tomb. Suddenly, a colossal shadow detached itself from the wall near the sacristy. Not a monk, but something far larger, far more ragged than any living thing. It was the great crucifix, a masterwork of sacred carving, torn violently from its moorings, high above the altar. The heavy carved corpus, wood heavier than a grown man and sanctified by centuries of prayer, crashed down onto the flagstones of the chapel floor with an impact that should have been deafening, shaking the very stones of the monastery. But there was no echoing boom, no satisfying, reverberating sound of destruction. Instead, the sound was flat, dead, swallowed instantly by the abnormal density of the air, creating a sickening vacuum-like thud, the chilling sound of reality being aggressively edited, silenced by the predator.
Thomas realized with a paralyzing horror that the environment was actively suppressing sound waves, silencing everything except the mountain's own terrifying bass hum, proving that the absolute silence they sought was now a trap set by the mountain itself. And then from the ruined sacristy wall, where the wood had splintered and the stone had been ripped from the mortar, came a new smell, sharp and metallic, cutting through the stale, freezing air. It was the unmistakable scent of fresh blood, warm and pooling somewhere unseen in the absolute dark. The enemy hadn't just turned out the lights and dismantled their sanctuary. It had drawn first blood from one of the brethren. And in the pitch black, Brother Thomas, against every fiber of his spiritual training, felt the forbidden, involuntary movement forming in his throat. A sound that could doom them all, but was necessary if any were to survive the night. The scream was coming, unstoppable and desperate. The air itself seemed to solidify around Brother Thomas, a physical weight of absolute zero, choking the nascent shmeek before it could tear free from the frozen cage of his lips. He wasn't fighting a physical attacker, or even the cold. He was fighting the absolute, ancient law of this place: silence. The terror that had coiled in his gut, the vision of the mountain swallowing the monastery whole, demanded auditory release. But the divine vow, amplified by the lethal atmosphere, held it prisoner. A prisoner of God and ice. A deep, subsonic tremor, far deeper than mere stone settling or snow shifting, pulsed through the floor of the scriptorium, resonating in the monks' teeth and the hollows of their chests. It wasn't the sound of natural rock movement, but the deliberate, slow, grinding adjustment of something monumental and impossibly heavy beneath the earth's crust. A sound that spoke of colossal power, harnessed for an unknown, sinister purpose. It felt as if the mountain had recognized the moment of weakness, the fraction of a second when a human soul contemplated rebellion against the sacred code of quietude, and it was now leaning in, listening closer, demanding its due. Abbot Elias, whose eyes had witnessed 80 savage alpine winters, felt the precise, terrifying change in the atmosphere, a shift that had nothing to do with mere temperature and everything to do with psychic and spiritual pressure. He knew that the true danger was not the sound that was made, but the sound that was prevented, the pressurized fear that had nowhere to go but inward, shattering the fragile boundaries between soul and sanity. The mountain demanded payment for silence, and if they cheated it of the sound of fear, it would extract a physical toll instead, turning this absolute, weaponized quietude into a self-consuming force. The freezing air was no longer just atmosphere. It was an active, creeping, crystalline predator, possessing a malevolent intelligence that sought to dismantle every organic and inorganic boundary. It coiled around the parchment scrolls on the tables, instantly turning the dried ink brittle, poised to shatter the accumulated knowledge and history of centuries into glittering, useless dust. Every single inhalation taken by the kneeling monks was a brutal, scraping agony, like trying to swallow crushed, frozen glass, filtering the thin, icy air through lungs already screaming for a warmth that the Alps had decided would never arrive again.
The iron core of their existence, the Benedictine rule, prescribed the votum silenti, not merely as discipline or spiritual preparation, but as a crucial defensive barrier against the world's clamor, a necessary prerequisite for the divine dialogue. But here, a mile above the closest whisper of civilization, the silence had become the antithesis of salvation, transforming into a suffocating, crushing void, a spiritual black hole designed to eradicate the ego and the body along with it. In the year 1050 CE, the concept of auditory sensory deprivation was unknown to any scientific mind, but the psychological effects were already brutally, irrevocably familiar to any monk who dared to live this high, this isolated, this far from human comfort and warmth. A new sound, sharper and far more disastrous than the grinding tremor, suddenly pierced the oppressive quiet, causing the monks' hearts to seize in their chests. It was the crack of stressed, ancient wood, followed by a high-pitched, resonant ping that echoed unnervingly off the cold stone. Brother Bernard, the monastery's trembling custodian of the sacristy, knew instantly what terrible violation had occurred. The holy water, the sanctified defense against the worldly evils, the most precious liquid store in the building, had finally succumbed to the deep freeze, taken by the unrelenting conquest of the elemental cold. The temperature had not just invaded the sanctified space, it had conquered the blessed essence itself, splitting the heavy ceramic container with the sheer, explosive, irresistible force of frozen expansion. They were witnessing a tangible, geological manifestation of spiritual defeat. The mountain had shattered the very vessel holding the protection of God, mocking their faith with simple physics. If the elemental malice could destroy the holy defense, what conceivable chance did their frail, exhausted, starving bodies have against the ancient, conscious antagonism of the stone and the cold? The final shattering sound was instantly absorbed by the thick, hungry stone walls and the devouring, insulating snow outside, leaving only the sickening echo of the violation hanging in the supercooled air. Abbot Elias moved, finally breaking his rigid, prayerful posture, gliding across the floor toward the scriptorium's darkest corner with the unnerving smoothness of a shadow, making less sound than falling dust. He approached the far wall of the chapter house, a massive section rarely examined, covered in ancient, flaking frescoes depicting the brutal, often fatal, trials of Saint Benedict himself. His finger, stiff and almost blue with cold, slowly traced a barely visible seam in the stone that no one, save perhaps the original builders and the current abbot, knew existed. This was the viam secretam, the emergency path, the hidden passage rumored in hushed circles to lead deep into the mountain's very infrastructure, a treacherous place they were forbidden, under the iron penalty of excommunication, ever to enter. The source of the rhythmic grinding, The sound that had been threatening to dismantle their sanity for 3 endless days was strongest here, vibrating in the very stone of the sacred wall. Elias pulled a hidden iron ring, barely thicker than a thumb, and the section of the stone wall groaned with agonizing slowness, a reluctant metallic sigh that seemed to violate the ancient sanctity of the chapter house more deeply than any shouted curse could have managed. It revealed a black, narrow aperture leading steeply downward into the earth, smelling immediately of ozone, mineral salts, and something indescribably ancient, metallic, and feral that had been sealed away from the light of God for millennia. This was where the silence truly died. This was where the mountain breathed, where the cold held dominion over the very laws of reality. And Abbot Elias knew, with the deep, chilling certainty of a man facing his final, terrible penance, that if they did not immediately meet the terror in the dark would rise and consume the monastery whole before the morning bells had a chance to ring. The fight was no longer spiritual. It was a desperate subterranean hunt against the very bones of the Alps. The silence, their meticulously maintained fortress against the world's chaos, had become the most terrifying weapon turned against them. It was no longer a spiritual discipline, but a pressure chamber where every microscopic sound amplified into a seismic event. This absolute lack of ambient noise allowed them to hear, with horrifying clarity, the approach of the thing beneath the rock. It wasn't the familiar groan of freezing timber or the shift of the deep snowpack. This was a grinding, rhythmic articulation of geology, a sound so ancient and vast that it seemed to predate humanity itself. It was the sound of immense friction, of millennia-old granite being pulverized into dust. And it was getting louder, closer, echoing up through the cold slate flooring of the monastic dormitory. Brother Thomas, the youngest novice, whose breath still feathered nervously in the brutal cold, clutched his worn wooden cross, his eyes wide with a terror that surpassed any fear of damnation. He felt the vibration first, a low-frequency hum that resonated in the soles of his feet, suggesting the unseen entity was directly beneath the chapel's foundation, mapping its structural weaknesses. The monastery, perched precariously on a jagged spur high above the valley floor, was constructed in the rugged, pragmatic style of the 11th century, dry stacked stone, heavy reliance on the inherent stability of the bedrock, and minimal, frost-prone mortar. This reliance was now their undoing. The bedrock itself was convulsing. A thin, terrifying line of white powder began to drift down from the intricately carved rib vaulting of the main cloister. It was pulverized limestone and grit, shaken loose by the subterranean turmoil. It looked like fine snow falling indoors, a horrifying sign that the structural integrity of the entire mountain stronghold was compromised. Abbot Ignatius, standing sentinel at the head of the dark hall, remained immobile, his shadow stretched long and thin by the single oil lamp burning stubbornly against the crushing cold. His posture was a desperate plea for order, a silent command for the brothers to cling to the rule of taciturnitas, silence at all costs.
He believed, fundamentally, that fear was a gateway for infernal forces, and that to break the vow of silence, to scream, to cry out, to even whisper a prayer outside the designated hours, was to give the mountain's dark predator permission to claim them. He was asking them to confront existential doom without making a sound.
But the instinct to survive, the primal, deep-seated urge to warn or flee, was warring savagely with centuries of spiritual training. Brother Thomas pressed his face into his rough woolen sleeve, trying to suppress the ragged, panicked gasps that felt deafening in the profound stillness.
The grinding noise beneath them suddenly stopped. The resulting silence was heavier, more oppressive than before, a suffocating vacuum that drew the very warmth and sound out of the air. It felt like the predator had ceased moving, not because it was gone, but because it had found its target. Then came the sound that ripped through the disciplined composure of the Brotherhood, a sound that no spiritual training could ever prepare them for. A sharp, fracturing, rending, followed by a deep, guttural thump that shook the entire structure down to its foundations. In the middle of the narrow scriptorium, where Brother Elias had been painstakingly illuminating a gospel years before, a massive slab of floorstone, weighing perhaps 500 pounds, was not lifted, it was violently ejected upward. It spun once, shattering against the low ceiling beams before crashing back down in pieces, revealing the horror beneath. A gaping maw had opened in the earth, a jagged, smoking pit of blackness that instantly exhaled a cold that was not merely freezing, but chemically painful, laden with the stench of sulfurous steam and ancient, raw minerals. This was the raw, open wound of the mountain itself. The hole was perfectly circular, impossibly smooth on the inside, suggesting it had been carved not by explosion, but by rotational pressure, a giant subterranean drill pressing upward through the bedrock. It was not a collapse. It was a deliberate breach, engineered by a force with impossible strength and terrifying precision.
Through the black void, the monks saw nothing, yet the feeling of observation was overwhelming. It was the feeling of being hunted by something that existed outside the realm of natural history, a silent, ravenous intelligence that had finally broken the skin of their sanctuary.
The cold intensified instantly, condensing the moisture in the air until tiny ice crystals rained down from the ceiling, like frozen ash. The last few embers in the main hearth sizzled and died, consumed by the unnatural cold radiating from the abyss. The monastery was plunging into absolute geological zero.
Abbot Ignatius finally moved, his face rigid, his eyes fixed on the black hole. He understood now. Whatever this thing was, it didn't just want their lives, it wanted their warmth, their sound, and their faith. He raised his hand. not in blessing, but in a final, defiant gesture of absolute, terrifying silence, standing guard over the hungry mouth that had just swallowed the floor.
The absolute silence that followed the collapse was not empty. It was a pressurized vacuum, sucking the very warmth and light from the air, a physical void carved into the heart of the monastery. Brother Felix, nearest the fissure, felt a breath, a glacial exhalation, rise from the abyss, smelling not of rock or damp earth, but of infinite, undisturbed antiquity, the smell of time frozen still. The chasm was not just a hole, it was a lung, breathing the death of the deep earth into their sacred space, an inverted chimney venting the subterranean malice. The scent of iron and methane rose, a choking perfume that tasted like old blood on the tongue, and every monk understood, without needing the forbidden utterance, that they were witnessing the mountain's structural heart failure. This was not a tremor caused by God's displeasure, but a fundamental geological protest against their intrusion, a declaration of territorial eviction written in splintered granite. Theodoricus, the iron abbot, remained immovable. His shadow stretched long and distorted over the jagged lip of the pit, a sentinel of stone guarding the precipice of his own sanity, refusing to bend the sacred vow even in the face of oblivion. He had sworn an oath more binding than the laws of physics. Absolute silence must prevail, for it was the vessel that contained their spiritual strength against the demonic clamor of the world. To speak now, even to command the necessary retreat, would be to concede immediate victory to the earthly chaos that sought to shatter their rule. But below him, the grinding began anew. It was a sound far deeper than a mere rock slide, a vast subterranean mastication, as if the very foundations of the monastery, built precariously on the Schreckensgrat, the ridge of terrors, were being slowly chewed by unseen gargantuan jaws. The low, resonant frequency vibrated not just in the walls, but deep within the marrow of the monks' bones, threatening to rattle their teeth loose from their skulls, a physical assault conducted entirely through sound and vibration. For generations, the order had boasted of their resilience, of having carved their sanctuary out of the very malice of the alpine gods. They were perched 2,400 meters above sea level, a defiant scar on the face of the Eiger's shadow, relying on gravity and God to hold the granite blocks in place. And now gravity seemed to be defecting, shifting its loyalty to the hungry void beneath them. The architecture, once a testament to human faith, now felt like a meticulously planned death trap.
The vaulted ceilings, designed to echo with the purity of silent prayer, now seemed primed only to amplify the sound of their impending doom. Brother Elias, the master architect who had studied the Roman techniques of arch and buttress, watched in frozen horror as a hairline crack, no wider than a strand of spun gold, zigzagged across the keystone directly above the sacristy entrance, the critical fulcrum of their protection.
The tension was unbearable, a spiritual wire drawn tighter than any physical bowstring. Each monk fought the primal urge to scream, to warn his brethren, to simply break the devastating pressure of the mandated stillness. Recognizing that this enforced silence, their greatest weapon, had become the cruelest tool of their tormentor. Brother Matthias, his face slick with freezing sweat, felt the cold not as an absence of heat, but as a malicious, thinking entity, pressing its vast, transparent weight down upon the roof beams, testing the load-bearing capacity of their terror. Every fiber of his being screamed for flight, yet his legs remained rooted, held fast by the sheer, terrifying authority of the abbot's silent, unblinking gaze. And then the sound changed once more. It was no longer the generic roar of collapsing stone or the dull grind of shifting fault lines. It became patterned, rhythmic, almost intelligent. It was a shuffling, the slow, heavy, scraping shuffle of something massive and burdened, moving beneath the thin crust of the monastery floor, circling the newly opened shaft like a predator scouting its prey. It was the sound of something dragging immeasurable weight, perhaps the shattered foundations of the ancient mountain itself, or perhaps something older, something pre-Christian, disturbed from its million-year slumber by the intrusion of human sanctity and steel. The legends whispered among the lower villagers, tales of the Beargeist, the mountain spirit that hated the sound of bells and the presence of men, were suddenly not vague parables, but terrifyingly literal descriptions of the horror they faced. The air temperature plummeted further, dropping so rapidly it felt like an actual physical blow, a concussive shock wave of cold air rising from the depths. The moisture in the atmosphere crystallized instantly, forming a fine, deadly frost that coated the interior walls and the monks' own wool habits, rendering the sanctuary visible only through a haze of ice particulate. Their breath turned to instant ice mist, catching the faint, flickering light of the single oil lamp, like tiny, suspended diamonds, beautiful in their deadly fragility. Fingers began to stiffen into useless claws, clinging desperately to the rosaries that offered no immediate physical comfort, no barrier against the encroaching frostbite. The cold was now an executioner, using silence as its blade, intending to render them utterly immobile and senseless before the inevitable structural collapse. They were statues awaiting impact, unable to even close their eyes against the horror unfolding at their feet, unable to signal their mortal pain. Abbot Theodoricus finally moved, his movement excruciatingly slow, a study in controlled agony, every muscle screaming in protest against the forced calm. He did not step back from the chasm. Instead, he reached into his sleeve, pulling forth the small, heavy silver crucifix, the relic of silence, which was usually locked within the central tabernacle.
It was the symbol of their absolute dedication to the rule of Saint Benedict, magnified by the impossible isolation of the peaks, a desperate physical prayer made manifest. He held it outward, aimed directly down the shaft, attempting to use the blessed object to sanctify or seal the abyss. An act of profound, desperate faith, a challenge thrown at the geology of hell itself.
The air was so thin and cold, it felt like breathing powdered glass, scraping against the inside of their lungs. The pressure differential was immense. Every monk felt his eardrums straining, threatening to burst from the geological violence raging just feet below the foundations, encased only by a few inches of ancient, failing mortar. This was the moment the spiritual battle became brutally physical. They had fought the demons of lust and pride, but how were they meant to fight the sheer, unyielding physics of a collapsing mountain? Theodoricus watched the silver cross tremble slightly in his aged hand, the weight of 1,000 years of monastic tradition focused on one point of fracturing bedrock.
He knew that if this holy object failed to halt the earth's rebellion, nothing physical could save them, and their silence would be the only dignity remaining. But as the cross cleared the lip of the pit, the shuffling sound beneath them ceased abruptly. The silence returned, this time heavier, more absolute, and infinitely more malevolent, suggesting the presence had not fled, but merely paused, perhaps observing the futile gesture of the human, waiting for the abbot to finish his prayer before continuing the feast.
The instant Abbot Elias's final, desperate amen echoed off the ice-coated stone walls, the atmospheric tension snapped back, far heavier than before. The silence that followed his prayer was not the cleansing peace of God, but the pregnant, suffocating quiet of a predator holding its breath, positioned directly behind its prey.
This was the ancient, terrifying calculus of the mountain. It had permitted the human to perform his small theatrical gesture, but now the reprieve was over, and the payment was due. The air in the chapel, already brutally cold, dropped an unimaginable 10 degrees in a single, terrifying second, condensing the very breath in their lungs into sudden, stinging shards of ice. He pulled harder, ignoring the searing pain in his joints, knowing that if the crypt seal shattered, they would not merely face a sound, but a manifestation of pure, unholy coldness rising from the earth. Finally, with a protesting shriek of metal, the lock mechanism yielded. Elias threw open the box, revealing a small, velvet-lined cavity. Inside lay the relic, a piece of bone, yellowish white, wrapped tightly in silk, embroidered with silver thread. The darkness was absolute, relieved only by the single faint reflection of moonlight catching the silver thread wrapping the relic in Elias's hand. He felt the weight of centuries of isolation and spiritual rigor pressing upon him.
Every monk who had ever served in St. Mortis, Every silent vigil kept against the crushing cold was now focused into this single, terrifying moment. He raised the relic high, a silent, desperate challenge against the primal antagonist that was the frozen heart of the world, daring the mountain to accept the ultimate sacrifice of human endurance.